There is a city at the bottom of the Black Sea, not a ruin scattered by waves, not broken stones softened by time, but a place that still looks like a place where people once lived. Streets that follow deliberate paths, structures that stand where they were built, wooden elements that should have vanished thousands of years ago, still holding their shape in the darkness. This is where the story begins, because according to everything we think we know, this should be impossible. For most of human history, the sea has been a destroyer of memory. Water erodes, salt corrodes, wood rots, rope dissolves. Even stone does not last forever beneath shifting currents and chemical decay. Entire coastal civilizations have disappeared with barely a trace because oceans do not preserve. They erase. And yet, beneath the Black Sea, they did not. When modern researchers first sent cameras into its depths, they were not expecting to find cities. They were not even expecting to find settlements. At most, they hoped for scattered tools or stone foundations that might hint at early human presence along an ancient shoreline. What they found instead forced them to reconsider the basic assumptions of underwater archaeology. Houses stood where houses should not stand. Wooden beams lay intact, not fossilized, not replaced by stone, but still wood. Fishing nets appeared frozen in motion, hanging where someone had last left them. Objects of daily life rested exactly where they were dropped, as if time itself had been interrupted. Before we go any deeper, feel free to let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always enjoy reading them. And as you watch, remember that the images you see are simply here to help set the atmosphere. They are not required to follow the story. Thank you, as always, for being here and for supporting what we do. The question was immediate and unsettling. If this is real, then something enormous must have happened here. Something fast enough to trap an entire world before it could decay. Something powerful enough to bury it beyond reach. Something that history never properly recorded. For decades, the Black Sea was not considered an archaeological priority. It was deep, dark, and hostile. Traditional diving was impossible. The depths were toxic, the pressure unforgiving. Compared to the Mediterranean, where ancient harbours and shipwrecks lay within reachable depths, the Black Sea seemed like a dead end. But the Black Sea is not like other seas. Below roughly 150 meters, oxygen disappears. Completely. No fish. No bacteria capable of consuming wood. No organisms that break down organic material. What sinks past this threshold enters a chemical silence where decay slows to almost nothing. This single fact changes everything. In most oceans, wood survives for decades at best. In the Black Sea, it can survive for thousands of years. That means the seafloor is not a graveyard of fragments. It is a vault, a sealed archive, a place where moments are not slowly erased but quietly held. And that is why this city exists. But understanding that does not answer the more important question. It only deepens it. How did an entire human landscape end up down there in the first place? This was not a harbour that slowly sank, not a shoreline gradually claimed by rising tides over centuries. The scale is wrong. The preservation is wrong. The context is wrong. Entire coastlines are submerged hundreds of feet below modern sea level. River valleys extend across the seafloor, carved when water flowed in the opposite direction. Beaches lie buried far offshore, perfectly shaped, as if the sea arrived all at once and never left. Geology confirms what intuition already suggests. The Black Sea was not always a sea. Long before it became the dark basin we know today, it was something else entirely. A vast freshwater lake, isolated from the oceans, surrounded by fertile land. A place where people could settle, farm, fish, and build lives that felt stable, permanent, safe. And they did. The evidence is no longer theoretical. Sonar mapping has traced ancient shorelines. Sediment cores show a sharp transition from freshwater organisms to saltwater species. Not gradual, not blended, sudden, like a switch being thrown. This is the first crack in the official story, because if the Black Sea transformed abruptly, then the people living around it did not have centuries to adapt. They did not slowly move inland as tides crept forward. They faced something closer to a wall than a wave, a force that arrived faster than memory could adjust. And yet, for a long time, this idea was dismissed. Flood stories were myths, cultural metaphors, moral allegories. Archaeologists were taught to separate legend from evidence, story from science, to treat ancient flood narratives as symbolic expressions of fear, not records of real events. But the city beneath the Black Sea refuses to stay symbolic. It demands an explanation rooted in physics, chemistry, and human behavior. It demands that myth and geology be placed in the same room and asked the same questions. Because here is the uncomfortable truth. If this city exists, then something erased it so completely that it vanished from human history while remaining physically intact. And if that happened here, it could have happened elsewhere. And if it happened elsewhere, then our understanding of how fragile early civilization truly was may be deeply incomplete. We like to imagine the past as a slow progression, stone to bronze, village to city, cave to cathedral, but the Black Sea offers a different image, one where entire worlds rise, stabilize, and disappear in spans shorter than a lifetime, where permanence is an illusion created by survival bias. We remember the civilizations that endured. We forget the ones that drowned. Standing at the edge of this discovery forces a choice. Either the city beneath the Black Sea is an anomaly, a rare coincidence of preservation and misinterpretation, or it is evidence of something much larger, a forgotten catastrophe, a real event whose scale was so overwhelming that it fractured memory itself, leaving behind only fragments in story and myth. This is not a story about Atlantis, not about advanced technology or lost superpowers. It is something both simpler and more disturbing. It is the story of ordinary people living in a place that felt eternal until it was not. Before we can understand how their world ended, we need to understand what it was. What kind of land existed here? What kind of lives were built along its shores? And why no one saw the end coming? Because the city that should not exist is only the beginning. Long before satellites traced coastlines and sonar mapped the ocean floor, people were already telling stories about water that rose too high and worlds that disappeared beneath it. These stories appear in cultures that never met, separated by deserts, mountains, and thousands of years. Yet when you strip away the gods, the symbolism, and the moral lessons layered on top, the core of the story remains strangely consistent. A stable world, a warning, sometimes ignored. Water that comes faster than expected. Survivors who escape, often by boat. And a new world that begins afterward. For a long time, scholars were comfortable explaining this away. Floods are common, rivers overflow, storms devastate coastlines. Water is humanity's oldest enemy, so of course it appears in myth. According to this view, flood stories are not memories of real events but metaphors. Cultural reflections of fear, chaos, and divine punishment. That explanation works until you start comparing details. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh tells of a man warned by the gods to build a vessel and save life from an approaching deluge. The flood lasts days. The world is destroyed. Birds are released to test whether land has returned. In the Hebrew tradition, Noah is told to do the same. Build a boat. Save animals in pairs. Survive a flood sent to erase a corrupt world. Birds are released. A mountain is reached. Life begins again. In Greek mythology, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a flood sent by Zeus to cleanse humanity. In Hindu texts, Manu is warned by a fish about an incoming flood and escapes aboard a boat tied to a mountain. Even in ancient Anatolia and the Caucasus, fragments of flood legends persist, often tied to inland seas and rising waters. These are not vague similarities. They are structural matches, the same narrative logic, the same sequence of events, the same emotional centre. And this is where the debate begins. Mainstream scholarship argues that similarity does not equal shared origin. Stories travel, cultures borrow, oral traditions merge. A powerful story spreads because it resonates, not because it records history. But there is another possibility, one that archaeology avoided for generations because it was uncomfortable. What if these stories are not symbolic inventions, but compressed memories? Oral traditions do not preserve dates or measurements. They preserve meaning. They remember what mattered most. When a trauma is large enough, it does not need precision to survive. It only needs repetition. Imagine witnessing your entire homeland disappear underwater. Not a seasonal flood that recedes, but a permanent transformation. Fields gone, villages gone, ancestors' graves lost forever, the land itself erased. That kind of event does not fade quietly into the background of memory. It defines identity. It becomes the dividing line between before and after. In that context, myth is not fiction. It is a survival mechanism. Details change. Gods are added. Moral explanations are imposed. Time is compressed. What took months or years becomes days in memory. What happened to thousands becomes the story of one righteous survivor. But the core remains because it must. Something drowned the world. For decades, archaeologists rejected this approach entirely. Myth was not evidence. Memory was unreliable. Science demanded physical proof, until geology began producing a problem of its own. Sediment cores from the Black Sea revealed a sharp boundary. Below it, freshwater organisms. Above it, saltwater species. No gradual blending, no long transition, a sudden ecological replacement. This was not what slow symbolic flooding looks like. At the same time, sonar mapping revealed drowned river valleys stretching across the seafloor. Rivers that once flowed into a freshwater basin, not out of it. Coastlines preserved hundreds of feet below modern sea level. Geology was quietly saying something myth had been shouting for thousands of years. Water came. The world changed, and it did not change slowly. Still, skepticism remains, and it should. Not all scientists agree on the speed or scale of the Black Sea flood. Some argue the water rose gradually enough for populations to adapt. That people moved inland over generations, not in panic. That no single catastrophic moment existed. Others counter that catastrophe is relative. If the shoreline retreats miles within a single lifetime, if villages vanish while children grow to adulthood, the experience is still apocalyptic. The difference between months and decades matters to scientists. It matters less to memory. And memory is what myths preserve. The real tension lies here. Science demands caution. Myth demands meaning. One strips away narrative, the other amplifies it. And yet, in the case of the Black Sea, both seem to be pointing toward the same unsettling conclusion. There may have been a real flood large enough to fracture human history into fragments of story. If that is true, then flood myths are not echoes of imagination. They are warnings, records of a world that believed itself stable until it was not. And if ancient people remembered this event well enough to pass it down for thousands of years, then perhaps they understood something we have forgotten. That water does not need permission, that coastlines are temporary, and that civilization, no matter how secure it feels, exists on borrowed time. To understand whether these stories truly reflect a real catastrophe, we need to step away from myth entirely and look at the landscape that existed before the flood. Not the sea we see today, but the world that vanished beneath it. Because before the Black Sea became a grave, it was something very different. Forget the dark water, the toxic depths, the lifeless lower layers. Forget the modern coastline, the ports, the shipping lanes. None of that existed. In fact, for most of human history, there was no Black Sea at all. There was a lake. A vast freshwater lake, isolated from the world's oceans, sitting hundreds of feet lower than today's sea level. Its shores stretched far beyond the modern coastline, exposing plains, river valleys, and fertile lowlands that no longer appear on any map. Geologists can see this world clearly now. The evidence is etched into the seafloor itself. Sonar mapping reveals ancient shorelines carved into submerged rock, beaches frozen in place far offshore, river channels winding across the seabed, cutting through terrain that should never have been underwater. These are not guesses. They are physical features that only form in open air, shaped by flowing freshwater and exposed land. Sediment cores confirm it. Below a certain depth, the biological signature changes completely. Freshwater algae, freshwater mollusks, fish species that cannot survive in salt water. Then abruptly they vanish. Above that line, marine organisms appear as if they arrived all at once. This is not how slow environmental change looks. For thousands of years after the last ice age began to loosen its grip, the Black Sea basin remained a stable freshwater environment. While glaciers melted elsewhere and oceans slowly rose, this lake stayed trapped behind natural barriers. Protected, isolated, predictable. And that predictability mattered. Climate conditions around the lake were unusually favourable. Temperatures moderated as the ice age ended. Rainfall was reliable. The region developed what we would now call a temperate Mediterranean-like climate. Warm summers, mild winters, long growing seasons. The shores of the lake were rich beyond measure. Freshwater fish were abundant. Pike, perch, sturgeon, species that thrive in lakes and rivers. Seasonal spawning runs would have filled the shallow waters with life, offering reliable food year after year. The surrounding land supported mixed forests and open meadows, ideal for both hunting and early agriculture. This combination is rare. Most early human settlements faced trade-offs. Rivers offered water but flooded unpredictably. Coastal regions provided food but were vulnerable to storms and tides. Arid regions were stable but demanded constant movement. The Black Sea Lake offered all three advantages without the risks. Fresh water without salt contamination, productive fisheries without tides, fertile land without seasonal catastrophe. It was, by every practical measure, an ideal place to settle, and people did. Archaeological evidence from areas now far inland shows that by 9,000 years ago, human communities were already thriving around the edges of this lake. Not temporary camps, but permanent settlements. Places where people built homes meant to last, not shelters meant to be abandoned. Pollen analysis tells the story quietly but clearly. Forests were being cleared. Cultivated plants appeared in the record. Wheat and barley pollen shows up where it should not exist naturally. This is the unmistakable signature of human intervention. People were not just passing through, they were reshaping the landscape. The geography of the basin encouraged this. Rivers flowed into the lake from every direction, carrying fresh sediment that renewed soil fertility. Floodplains formed naturally along these waterways, creating ideal conditions for early farming. Settlements clustered near river mouths and along gentle slopes overlooking the water. From above, the ancient shoreline would have looked alive. Villages scattered along the coast, boats pulled up onto beaches, fields stretching inland, smoke rising from hearths at dusk. This world endured for generations, And that endurance is precisely why the catastrophe that followed mattered so much. When a society believes its environment is stable, it plans differently. It builds differently. It invests in permanence. Houses grow more solid. Fields are carefully tended. Social bonds deepen. Trade networks expand. You do not do these things if you expect the land to disappear. The people living around the Black Sea lake had no reason to believe it would. For thousands of years, nothing suggested otherwise. The water level fluctuated slightly with rainfall, as lakes always do, but it never threatened the shoreline. The natural barriers holding back the oceans had existed longer than memory. From a human perspective, they were eternal. But geology does not recognize eternity. While life continued along the lake, forces far beyond the horizon were quietly building pressure. The global climate was changing. Ice sheets were melting. Sea levels were rising. And on the other side of the natural barrier separating the lake from the Mediterranean, water was climbing toward a tipping point. The people on the lake's shores could not see this. They had no instruments, no long-term records, no concept of global sea level rise. The land beneath their feet felt solid. The water they depended on tasted the same as it always had. Their world gave no warning. And that is what makes the drowned city so unsettling. It was not built in defiance of danger. It was built in trust. Trust that the land would remain. Trust that the water would stay where it belonged. To understand how that trust was broken, we need to look more closely at the people themselves. Not just where they lived, but how they lived. What kind of society had grown in this forgotten basin, and how much there was to lose when the water finally came. For a long time, the people who lived around the ancient Black Sea lake were imagined as simple and transitional. Early farmers, small communities, a brief step between nomadic hunting and the rise of true civilization elsewhere. That assumption no longer holds. What the evidence reveals is not a marginal culture clinging to survival, but a society that had already crossed a critical threshold. These people were not experimenting with settlement. They had committed to it. Archaeological traces recovered from the drowned coastline and surrounding highlands tell a consistent story. Permanent dwellings built on stone foundations. Storage pits dug deep into the earth. Hearths used repeatedly over long periods of time. These are not the marks of temporary occupation. They are signatures of stability. The scale matters. Many Neolithic sites elsewhere in the world are small. A few huts, a few dozen people, highly vulnerable, easily abandoned. But around the ancient Black Sea lake, settlement density appears unusually high. Clusters of communities positioned strategically along river mouths and fertile plains suggest coordinated occupation rather than isolated chance. This raises an uncomfortable question. Why did this region support so many people so early? The answer lies in abundance. The lake provided reliable protein through fishing. The surrounding land supported early agriculture. Wild game thrived in nearby forests. These resources did not compete with one another. They complemented each other. If crops failed one year, fishing could compensate. If hunting declined, stored grain provided security. This diversity created resilience, and resilience creates surplus. Surplus is the quiet engine of civilization. It frees time. It allows specialization. It gives people the space to do more than survive. And the archaeological record shows clear signs that this was already happening. Pottery fragments recovered from sites around the basin are not crude or purely functional. Many show consistent forms and decorative patterns. This suggests shared cultural traditions and aesthetic choices. Decoration does not feed a family. It feeds identity. Tools tell the same story. Stone implements were no longer limited to basic cutting and scraping. Specialized tools appear for woodworking, fishing, hide processing, and plant preparation. Bone hooks and net weights indicate systematic fishing practices. These people understood their environment well enough to exploit it efficiently. This was not accidental knowledge. It was accumulated. Agriculture, too, had moved beyond experimentation. Domesticated wheat and barley varieties, recovered from the region, show traits that only emerge after generations of selective breeding. These crops were easier to harvest, more productive, better suited to local conditions. This means farmers were planning across seasons and years, saving seed, choosing which plants to propagate, passing agricultural knowledge down through families. In other words, this was not a society waiting to become something else. It already was something, and yet it does not fit neatly into the traditional map of early civilization. When we talk about the birth of complex societies, attention usually turns south: Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent, the Nile. These regions left behind monuments, writing, and centralized authority. They dominate the historical narrative because they left records. The Black Sea communities did not. They built in wood and earth, not stone temples. They relied on oral tradition rather than writing. Their social organization left subtle traces rather than monumental ones. As a result, they slipped through the cracks of history. But absence of writing does not mean absence of complexity. Settlement layouts suggest planning. Houses were often arranged in deliberate patterns rather than scattered randomly. Shared spaces appear between structures, possibly used for communal work or gathering. Some sites show evidence of multiple construction phases, indicating long-term occupation and improvement over time. People lived here for generations. Trade networks reinforce this picture. Materials found at Black Sea sites often originated far beyond the basin. Obsidian from Anatolia, amber from northern regions, shells from distant coastlines. These items did not arrive by accident. They moved through exchange networks connecting communities across hundreds of kilometers. Trade implies trust, repeated contact, social agreements. It implies that these settlements were part of a wider world, not isolated pockets of survival. This is where the narrative becomes uncomfortable for traditional timelines. If communities around the Black Sea were already stable, productive, and connected by 9,000 years ago, then the map of early human development needs adjustment. Civilization was not emerging in a single place and radiating outward. It was developing in parallel, adapting to local environments in ways that did not always leave obvious monuments behind. The people of the Black Sea Basin had solved the fundamental problems of survival. They had food security, they had social continuity, they had knowledge systems passed across generations, they had a future. And that is what makes their disappearance so important. When this world was destroyed, it was not a marginal experiment that failed. It was a functioning society erased mid-sentence, a trajectory cut short, a cultural path that never had the chance to reach the complexity we associate with later civilizations. This raises a final and unsettling possibility. If this society had not been drowned, history might look very different. The center of early European civilization might not have formed where it did. Trade routes, language spread, cultural influence, all could have followed alternate paths. Instead, the water came, and when it did not just flood land. It interrupted a story that had already begun. To understand how such a complete interruption was possible, we need to examine the one feature that made this paradise vulnerable: the natural barrier that protected the lake for thousands of years and the forces that eventually overwhelmed it. Because no civilization falls without a weak point. Every stable world rests on assumptions so old they stop being questioned. For the people living around the ancient Black Sea Lake, one of those assumptions was simple: the water stayed where it belonged. To the south of the lake stood a strip of land that separated it from another body of water entirely. Beyond that land lay the Sea of Marmara, and further still, the Mediterranean. To the people who lived along the lake's shores, this barrier was not a boundary in any meaningful sense. It was just land, hills, rock, a part of the world that had always been there. No one marked it on maps. No one monitored its elevation. No one imagined it as a wall holding back an ocean. But that is exactly what it was. Geological surveys show that this land bridge was not massive or mountainous. It was relatively narrow and low by continental standards, in places only a few hundred feet higher than the lake itself, composed largely of sedimentary rock and limestone, shaped over millennia by water and tectonic stress. It did not need to be strong forever. It only needed to be strong long enough for people to believe it always would be. For thousands of years it was. While glaciers melted across the planet at the end of the last ice age, global sea levels rose steadily, inches per decade, feet per century. Slow enough to escape human perception, but relentless. The Mediterranean climbed higher and higher, fed by meltwater from retreating ice sheets. On the northern side of the barrier, nothing appeared to change. The Black Sea Lake remained stable, protected by its natural dam. Rainfall still came. Rivers still flowed. Shorelines shifted slightly with seasons, but never enough to cause alarm. This created a dangerous illusion. From the perspective of human experience, the barrier was permanent. No one alive had ever seen it fail. No stories warned of its collapse. No myths described water pouring in from the south. The past offered no cautionary tale, and so the people planned their lives accordingly. They built homes meant to last. They cultivated fields year after year. They buried their dead in places they believed would remain dry forever. They expanded settlements closer to the shoreline, confident in the predictability of the lake. This is how vulnerability hides itself. Not in visible danger, but in long periods of calm. Meanwhile, on the other side of the barrier, pressure was increasing. As sea levels rose, the Mediterranean pushed against the land bridge with growing force. Water seeks equilibrium. It presses against every weakness. It infiltrates fractures. It dissolves limestone slowly but relentlessly. What begins as seepage becomes erosion. What begins as erosion becomes instability. The barrier did not need a single dramatic failure to begin its collapse. Small changes were enough. Underground channels widened. Microfractures expanded. Sections of rock weakened under constant hydraulic pressure. From the lake's side, none of this was visible. There were no earthquakes large enough to shatter settlements, no tsunamis, no sudden signs of impending disaster. If anything, the world appeared calm, predictable, safe. This is where scientific debate enters the story. Some researchers argue that the barrier failed suddenly and catastrophically, that a tipping point was reached after which erosion accelerated beyond control, that once water began flowing from the Mediterranean into the lake, the difference in elevation created a self-reinforcing cascade. Others argue for a slower breach, a gradual overtopping, a steady inflow that increased over time rather than exploding all at once. The distinction matters to science, but less to lived experience, because even a gradual failure, once underway, would have been unstoppable. The moment Mediterranean water began pouring into the Black Sea basin, gravity took over. The lake sat hundreds of feet lower. Water did not trickle downward. It rushed. And as it rushed, it carved. As it carved, it widened the channel. As the channel widened, more water flowed. This is not speculation. It is physics. Water does not negotiate with land. It erodes until balance is achieved. What matters is not whether the collapse took days, months, or years. What matters is that the system shifted from stable to irreversible. Once that happened, the fate of the lake and everything around it was sealed. From a human perspective, the change would have felt sudden regardless of the timeline. A shoreline that had been fixed for generations began to move. Fields flooded. Freshwater tasted different. Fish populations changed. Rivers reversed their behavior. These are not subtle signals when you depend on the land for survival. The natural dam that had protected the lake for millennia did not announce its failure. It did not crack dramatically in front of witnesses. It simply reached a point where it could no longer hold back an ocean. And when it failed, it did not fail for a day or a season. It failed permanently. This is the moment when stability turned into motion, when the invisible threat became a visible force, when a world that had felt eternal began to dissolve at its edges. To understand what that moment meant for the people living along the shores, we need to look closely at what happened next. Not in abstract geological terms, but as a lived event, because when the Mediterranean finally broke through, it did not just change a lake into a sea, it changed the course of human history. At some point around 5600 BCE, equilibrium failed, not in a dramatic instant marked by fire or thunder, but in a way far more dangerous. Quietly at first, almost invisibly, then all at once. The Mediterranean had been rising for thousands of years, patient, persistent, pressing against the natural barrier separating it from the lower Black Sea basin. Every year, more water. Every year, more pressure. Until the difference in elevation between the two bodies of water reached a critical threshold. What happened next is one of the most debated events in early human history. According to the catastrophic flood hypothesis proposed by William Ryan and Walter Pittman, the barrier failed suddenly. When it did, seawater did not seep gently into the lake. It surged. The Black Sea basin lay hundreds of feet below the Mediterranean. Gravity took over. Water rushed downhill with overwhelming force, carving a channel through the Bosphorus region that widened as it flowed. What began as a breach became a torrent. Some estimates suggest the volume of water pouring into the basin was equivalent to hundreds of Niagara Falls combined. Not for minutes, not for hours, but continuously, day after day. From a geological perspective, this was a system correcting itself. From a human perspective, it was the end of the world. The lake began to rise. At first, the change may have seemed manageable, a shoreline shifting inward, low-lying fields becoming waterlogged, reeds drowning where they had grown for generations. But the rise did not stop. It accelerated. Conservative models suggest the water level could have risen several inches per day. In some scenarios, more. That number sounds small until you place it in a human landscape. Inches per day means feet per month. Entire valleys swallowed in a season. Villages that once sat safely inland suddenly finding themselves on the water's edge. And this was not a typical flood. River floods recede. Storm surges withdraw. Even catastrophic inundations usually leave room for recovery. This one did not. The water that came did not go back. Every day it rose again. For people living along the ancient shoreline, there was no precedent, no cultural memory, no inherited strategy. Their ancestors had never faced anything like this. The lake had always behaved like a lake. Now it was behaving like something else entirely. Saltwater began to invade freshwater ecosystems. Fish populations collapsed or fled. Drinking water sources became contaminated. Crops failed as soil salinity increased. Even before homes were submerged, life became unsustainable. Some scientists argue the flooding unfolded over decades rather than months. That people had time to retreat gradually, moving settlements inland as the shoreline advanced. That the event, while dramatic, was not the sudden apocalypse described in flood myths. Others point to the sharp geological transition layers, the absence of gradual mixing, and the scale of erosion as evidence of rapid change. They argue that once the barrier failed, the process could not have been slow. The truth may lie somewhere between these extremes. But from the perspective that matters most, the human one, the distinction may be irrelevant. If you are born in a village by a lake and die watching that same land disappear beneath salt water, the experience is catastrophic, regardless of whether it took 5 years or 50. The world you knew ended within a single lifetime. That is enough to fracture memory. As the water rose, choices narrowed. Stay and adapt, hoping the rise would stop. Move inland temporarily, expecting to return. Or abandon everything and flee. None of these choices were easy. Livestock could not be moved indefinitely. Stored grain was heavy. Homes represented years of labour. Ancestors were buried in the soil. Leaving meant severing ties not just to land, but to identity, and yet staying meant death. As the shoreline advanced, rivers reversed their flow, pushing salt water far inland. Areas that appeared safe were suddenly inundated from unexpected directions. Marshes expanded. Low ridges became islands. Familiar paths vanished. This was not a single wall of water racing across the land. It was worse. It was relentless. Predictable in its direction, unpredictable in its timing. A slow enough advance to allow hope, fast enough to destroy it. Communities fragmented. Some families left early, scattering in different directions. Others waited too long. Some likely attempted to rebuild repeatedly, moving their homes uphill again and again until there was nowhere left to go. Boats became lifelines, not for exploration or trade, but for escape. Fishing vessels were repurposed. Rafts were built. People crossed expanding waters to reach higher ground, carrying children, tools, seeds, anything they could salvage. Many did not make it. The archaeological record is silent on their individual fates, but the absence of continued occupation speaks clearly. Settlements end abruptly. Tools are left behind. Homes are abandoned mid-use. The pattern is not orderly relocation, it is interruption. By the time the water levels finally stabilized, the Black Sea was no longer a lake. It was a sea, a saltwater body connected permanently to the Mediterranean, stratified, anoxic at depth, hostile to the kind of life that had once thrived there. An entire world had been erased, not by war, not by collapse from within, but by a shift in the balance of water and land. What remained were survivors, people who carried with them memories of a place that no longer existed, memories of fields and villages now hundreds of feet below the surface. Those memories did not stay with them quietly. They travelled. And in travelling, they changed the shape of human history in ways that would not become visible for thousands of years. To understand that legacy, we need to follow the people who escaped the rising waters and ask a difficult question. Where did the refugees of a drowned world go, and what did they bring with them? When the water did not stop rising, movement became inevitable. The people who lived along the shores of the ancient Black Sea Lake did not disappear all at once. Most did not die where they stood. They left. Quietly at first, then in numbers large enough to reshape the regions they entered. This is one of the most overlooked consequences of the flood. Catastrophe does not only destroy, it redistributes. As the shoreline advanced, families gathered what they could carry: tools, seed grain, livestock if possible, children too young to understand why the land they knew was being abandoned. The elderly who could no longer walk far enough were sometimes left behind. Others were carried until the weight became impossible. These were not explorers. They were refugees. They did not move toward opportunity. They moved away from annihilation. The geography of escape was uneven. To the north, the land opened into vast plains that stretched for hundreds of miles. To the west, routes led toward the Balkans. To the east, valleys and passes opened toward Anatolia and the Caucasus. South was largely blocked by the rising sea itself. This meant dispersal, not migration. Groups fractured, extended families split, entire communities dissolved as people fled in different directions based on terrain, chance, and survival. Whatever social cohesion had once defined life around the lake was broken by necessity. And yet, these people were not empty-handed. They carried knowledge. They knew how to farm. They knew which crops could be grown reliably. They knew how to manage animals, how to fish, how to build durable homes, how to store food through winter. They had already solved problems that many hunter-gatherer societies were still struggling with. This made them valuable, but also threatening. When large numbers of displaced people enter regions already occupied, tension follows. Some were likely absorbed into existing communities through marriage and alliance. Others may have competed for land and resources. Conflict was almost certainly part of the story, even if it left little trace. But over time, something else happened. The agricultural practices of the refugees spread. Archaeological layers across southeastern Europe show sudden changes around the same general period. New crops appear. Pottery styles shift. Settlement patterns reorganize. In some areas, farming seems to arrive faster than expected, without the long experimental phase seen elsewhere. This suggests transfer, not invention. The people who fled the Black Sea were not learning agriculture for the first time. They were carrying it with them into regions where it could take root quickly. In this sense, the flood did not halt the Neolithic expansion. It accelerated it. This challenges a deeply held assumption. We often imagine agriculture spreading slowly, village by village, over thousands of years. But catastrophe compresses time. It forces rapid movement of ideas, technologies, and people. What might have taken centuries under stable conditions can happen in generations when survival is at stake. The refugees did not just bring farming, they brought stories. They told their children about the land that drowned, about the lake that turned into a sea, about the day the water did not stop. These were not abstract tales. They were personal histories, accounts of loss, fear, and escape. And because so many people experienced the same disaster, the stories reinforced each other. Different groups told different versions. Some emphasized divine warning. Others focused on human failure. Some remembered boats. Others remembered mountains. But the core remained. Water rose. The old world ended. Survivors rebuilt. This is how shared trauma becomes cultural memory. Over generations, details blurred. Locations shifted. Characters merged. The story condensed. What had happened to thousands became the story of one family. What had taken years became a storm of days. The geography narrowed. The meaning deepened. And eventually the story became sacred. This process did not require writing. Oral tradition is remarkably resilient when it carries identity. Songs, rituals, seasonal retellings, myths embedded in ceremony. These methods preserve emotional truth long after factual precision fades. The flood became more than history. It became origin. In Mesopotamia, the flood marked the boundary between antediluvian kings and the age of cities. In later traditions, it became a moral reset, a cleansing, a judgment. In others, it became a lesson about respecting natural forces. Different meanings, same memory. Not everyone accepts this interpretation. Some scholars argue that cultural diffusion alone explains the spread of flood myths, that stories travel because people trade and interact, not because they share a single catastrophe. Others point out that flooding is common worldwide, and independent invention is likely. These arguments have merit, but they struggle to explain the timing. The Black Sea flood occurred at a critical moment, just before the rise of complex societies in Mesopotamia, just before writing, just before myths began to be fixed in text. It sits at the threshold between prehistory and history, where memory still flowed freely and had not yet been locked into stone. It is exactly where you would expect a real event to become legend. The refugees of the drowned world did not know they were reshaping human culture. They were trying to survive. But survival has consequences. The movement of people carries ideas, technologies, and memories farther than trade ever could. When they settled in new lands, they built again. They farmed again. They raised children who had never seen the lake their parents spoke of. But the stories remained because they explained why the world could not be trusted to stay the same. And somewhere beneath the Black Sea, the places those stories described remained untouched, sealed in darkness, waiting. To confirm whether these memories reflect a real catastrophe, scientists eventually had to do something unprecedented. They had to go looking for a lost world not on land, but beneath a sea that was never supposed to preserve it. That search would change everything we thought we knew about the ancient past. It happens when an event is too large to fit into ordinary experience, too disruptive to be treated as just another chapter. When that happens, societies do not simply remember what occurred, they transform it. This is how catastrophe becomes sacred. For the survivors of the Black Sea flood, the destruction of their world was not just physical, it was existential. Land that had sustained generations vanished. The rules that governed nature broke without warning. Water crossed boundaries it had never crossed before. When reality becomes unpredictable, people look for meaning. The earliest versions of the flood story were probably simple. The water rose. We fled. Everything was lost. Over time, these accounts were retold, refined, and shaped by the needs of the communities that carried them. Each retelling added structure. Each generation added interpretation. This is where gods enter the story. Divine warning explains why some survived. Divine punishment explains why the flood happened at all. Moral framing restores order to a world that otherwise feels random and cruel. If the flood was sent for a reason, then the universe is still intelligible. From a scientific perspective, this is mythology. From a human perspective, it is psychology. Trauma demands explanation. Anthropologists studying oral traditions have long observed this pattern. Disasters that permanently alter landscapes tend to be preserved far longer in memory than ordinary events. Volcanic eruptions, massive earthquakes, and coastal inundations can survive in story for thousands of years if they are tied to identity. The Black Sea flood fits this pattern almost perfectly. It was not a seasonal event. It did not recede. It transformed geography itself, and it affected not one community but many simultaneously. That shared experience created a shared narrative space. But there is a problem. Sacred stories compress time. What unfolded over years or decades becomes a single dramatic episode. Gradual loss becomes sudden destruction. Collective survival becomes the story of one chosen individual. These changes make the story easier to transmit, but harder to recognize as historical. This is where skepticism enters. Critics argue that flood myths cannot be treated as evidence, that they are too symbolic, too moralized, too detached from measurable reality. They warn against retrofitting science to match ancient texts. That caution is valid, but it cuts both ways. Science also carries assumptions. One of them is that ancient people could not accurately remember complex environmental events across long spans of time. Another is that without writing, memory decays beyond usefulness. Both assumptions are being challenged. Studies of indigenous oral histories in Australia and the Pacific have shown that stories describing sea level rise after the last ice age align closely with geological evidence, even after being passed down for more than 7,000 years. These traditions preserve details about coastlines that no longer exist. Memory, it turns out, can be remarkably precise when tied to place and survival. The question then becomes uncomfortable. If oral traditions can preserve real events for thousands of years, how many myths have been dismissed too quickly? The Black Sea flood sits at the center of this debate because it offers something rare: a convergence of evidence. Geology shows a rapid transformation. Archaeology reveals sudden abandonment. Ocean chemistry explains preservation. And mythology remembers a world lost to water. None of these alone prove the story. Together they demand attention. This does not mean every detail of flood myths is literal. Mountains, gods, and animals gathered in pairs reflect cultural frameworks, not data logs. But beneath those layers, a simpler memory persists. The water came. The land disappeared. Survival required movement. Sacred stories did not erase this memory. They protected it. In this sense, mythology becomes a storage system, a way to carry warnings forward through time when no other medium exists. The story does not need to explain hydraulics or tectonics. It only needs to teach one lesson. The world can change faster than you expect, and that lesson matters. Because the people who told these stories were not primitive fantasists. They were survivors trying to ensure their descendants never forgot what water can do. The tragedy is that we did forget. For centuries, flood myths were treated as childish tales, moral fables, religious exaggerations. They were separated from serious inquiry and placed safely in the realm of imagination. It took a sunken city to force a reconsideration. But myth alone was never going to convince science. For that, something more was needed, something tangible, something that could be measured, sampled, and documented. That proof did not come from ancient texts. It came from robots descending into darkness, cameras cutting through black water, and a sea that refused to rot the past away. The next chapter of this story does not begin in legend, but in a laboratory and aboard a research vessel. Because once scientists realized the Black Sea preserved what no other sea could, the search for the drowned world truly began. For thousands of years, the Black Sea kept its secret simply by being inaccessible. Its surface looked ordinary. Ships crossed it. Fishermen worked its shallows. Coastal cities rose and fell along its edges. Nothing about the water hinted that beneath it lay one of the most perfectly preserved archaeological archives on Earth. The key was something invisible: oxygen, or rather, the absence of it. Below roughly 150 meters, the Black Sea becomes anoxic. There is no oxygen to support fish, worms, or bacteria that normally break down organic material. The deep water is chemically hostile to life, saturated with hydrogen sulfide. Nothing moves, nothing eats, nothing decays the way it should. For archaeology, this changes everything. In most oceans, wooden structures vanish quickly. Shipwrecks collapse, rope dissolves, textiles disappear, even bone degrades. What remains are fragments, clues that must be interpreted and reconstructed. In the Black Sea, objects do not vanish, they wait. This fact was understood in theory long before it was tested in practice. But until technology advanced enough to explore extreme depths safely, it remained a curiosity rather than an opportunity. That changed in the late 20th century. In 1999, an expedition led by oceanographer Robert Ballard turned its attention away from famous wrecks and towards something far older. Ballard was already known for discovering the Titanic. What interested him about the Black Sea was not treasure, but preservation. If ancient ships could survive there, he reasoned, then ancient settlements might have as well. Using deep-water sonar and remotely operated vehicles, his team began mapping the seafloor near the Turkish coast. They were not looking for buildings. They were looking for shorelines. And they found them. Clear geological boundaries emerged on sonar screens. Ancient beaches, terraces shaped by waves long gone, river channels carved when the basin was still dry land. These were unmistakable features of a world that had once existed above water. Then the cameras descended. At first there was nothing. Mud, sediment, darkness broken only by the lights of the submersible. But then shapes began to appear. Straight lines, right angles, patterns that nature does not make casually. Wooden beams lay embedded in the sediment, aligned in ways that suggested construction rather than accident. Tool marks were visible, joints carved to fit other pieces of wood that were no longer present. This was not driftwood, it was architecture. Samples were collected carefully. Carbon dating followed. The results placed the structures squarely in the period predicted by the Black Sea flood hypothesis. Around 5600 BCE. The implications were immediate and unsettling. This was physical evidence of human construction at depths that could only have been dry land before a massive rise in water level, and it was preserved so well that it might as well have been abandoned yesterday. Further expeditions expanded the picture. Along the Bulgarian coast, sonar surveys revealed entire settlement complexes. Stone foundations arranged in deliberate patterns, post holes marking where wooden supports once stood, storage pits, hearths, spaces that made sense only in the context of daily life. Some sites showed multiple building phases, homes constructed, modified, expanded, and rebuilt over generations. These were not temporary camps hastily abandoned, they were communities with history. And the artifacts told stories that land-based archaeology rarely can. Organic materials appeared in abundance. Wooden tools, baskets woven from plant fibres, ropes still twisted tightly. Fishing nets preserved well enough to reconstruct knotting techniques and mesh size. In one case, the remains of a fishing net revealed exactly what size fish people were targeting and how they harvested them. This level of detail is almost unheard of in Neolithic archaeology. Food remains added another layer. Nuts still in shells. Seeds with bite marks from rodents. Fish bones bearing cut marks from stone knives. The debris of everyday meals frozen in place. These were not ritual deposits. They were leftovers. The Black Sea was doing something archaeology had never seen at this scale. It was preserving life, not just structure. The deeper the research went, the clearer the pattern became. Settlements clustered along ancient river mouths and gentle slopes overlooking the former lake. The same locations modern humans choose when they settle near water. Nothing about these sites suggested panic-driven construction or last-minute occupation. Everything pointed to long-term planning in a stable environment, which raises a critical point. These communities were not living in anticipation of disaster. They were living as if the land would remain. This strengthens the case against slow, predictable flooding. If people had seen the water rising steadily over centuries, settlements would have migrated gradually. Structures would show signs of adaptation. They do not. Instead, the archaeological record shows interruption. Tools left behind. Homes abandoned with contents intact. No signs of systematic dismantling or relocation. This is what sudden disruption looks like. Still, debate continues. Some researchers caution that underwater preservation can exaggerate impressions of abruptness, that even gradual abandonment might appear sudden when viewed through incomplete data. They urge restraint in drawing conclusions. That caution is necessary, but it cannot erase the broader pattern. Geological data, archaeological context, chemical preservation, they all align around a single moment of transformation. The Black Sea did not slowly forget its past. It sealed it. And in doing so, it created an archive so precise that it allows us to peer directly into a world that should have vanished without a trace. The question now is not whether something happened here. It is how much remains undiscovered. Because what has been found so far represents only a fraction of the ancient shoreline. Most of it still lies unmapped, buried under sediment, waiting for the next descent into darkness. And among those depths, there is another category of preservation that would push the story beyond villages and farms into something far larger. Because the Black Sea did not only preserve the moment a world drowned, it preserved everything that sank into it afterward. The story of the Black Sea does not end in the past. That is the most uncomfortable realization to emerge from everything buried beneath its waters. This was not a unique anomaly, not a one-time failure of nature that modern civilization has somehow outgrown. It was a reminder of how fragile stability really is and how easily permanence becomes illusion. The people who lived around the ancient Black Sea lake had every reason to believe their world was secure. Their ancestors had lived there for generations. The water behaved predictably. The land provided reliably. Nothing in living memory suggested catastrophe, and yet the conditions that destroyed them were already in motion, invisible, accumulating far beyond their horizon. That is the pattern we need to confront. Civilizations do not fall only because of war, corruption, or internal collapse. Sometimes they fall because the environment they depend on quietly changes state. A system that appeared stable crosses a threshold and the rules rewrite themselves. The Black Sea flood shows what that looks like. A natural barrier holds for thousands of years. Sea levels rise slowly enough to escape notice. Pressure builds where no one is watching. Then equilibrium fails. Not with warning sirens or clear lines on a calendar, but with water moving where it has never moved before. By the time the danger becomes visible, options are already limited. The archaeological record makes this painfully clear. The people of the Black Sea did not prepare for the flood because preparation would have required imagining something no one had ever seen. They did not fail because they were ignorant or careless. They failed because their past gave them no reason to expect their future to disappear. Modern civilization rests on similar assumptions. We build cities on coastlines because coastlines have always been there. We invest in infrastructure designed for historical conditions, not emerging ones. We trust averages and models because they describe the past accurately, even when the future may not behave the same way. The Black Sea warns us that systems do not fail linearly. They fail abruptly. There is another lesson buried beneath the water, one that goes beyond environmental risk. The flood did not erase humanity. It redistributed it. The refugees who fled the rising waters carried knowledge with them. Farming techniques, animal husbandry, social structures, stories, their forced movement reshaped the cultural landscape of entire regions. In this sense, catastrophe became a driver of change rather than an endpoint. This complicates the way we think about collapse. We often imagine collapse as disappearance, but more often it is transformation. People move, ideas spread, new societies form in the aftermath of loss. The cost is immense, but the story does not end. That does not make catastrophe acceptable. It makes it consequential. There is also an ethical dimension to what lies beneath the Black Sea. These submerged settlements are not just archaeological sites. They are homes, graves, places where people lived ordinary lives until the day their world ended. The question of whether to excavate them is not purely scientific. It is moral. Some argue these sites should remain untouched, preserved in darkness as underwater memorials. Others argue that studying them is the only way to honor the people who lived there by ensuring their story is not lost again. Both positions carry weight. Complicating matters further is the reality of the present. The Black Sea is warming. Climate change is altering water chemistry and circulation patterns. The anoxic layer that preserved these sites for thousands of years is not guaranteed to remain stable. As temperatures rise, oxygen-rich water may begin to mix deeper. When that happens, decay will begin. Wood that survived 7 millennia could rot within decades. The archive could vanish as suddenly as the world it preserves. At the same time, commercial pressures are increasing. Offshore drilling, seismic surveys, shipping infrastructure. These activities do not prioritize preservation. Archaeology competes with economics, and economics usually wins. This creates a race against time. We are the first generation capable of discovering these drowned worlds. We may also be the last with the chance to study them intact. The Black Sea flood forces us to rethink more than ancient history. It challenges how we understand memory, myth, resilience, and vulnerability. It asks whether we have learned anything from the civilizations that believed their world was permanent. Because somewhere beneath the Black Sea, entire communities remain exactly where they were left. Houses still standing, tools still lying on floors, evidence of lives interrupted but not erased. They are not relics of fantasy. They are proof that history is far more fragile than we like to believe. If this story resonated with you, a simple like or share helps more than you might think. And if you want to continue exploring forgotten worlds like this one, consider subscribing to the channel. It allows us to keep telling these stories and to keep going deeper. The Great Flood was not just a story told to explain the world. It was the world explaining itself to those who survived it. And the question it leaves us with is not what happened to them. It is whether we are any better prepared than they were.